Hey, welcome back to the inaugural Belonging at Work Summit. I am super thrilled to introduce you all to Lily Zheng, author, organizational consultant, and executive coach. So a little bit about Lily, if you aren't familiar with her amazing work. She works to create just, inclusive, and innovative workplaces for her clients through data-driven assessments, yay data, strategic advising, training, and collaborative content creation. A dedicated changemaker and advocate, Lily has published her work in the New York Times, Entrepreneur Magazine, and HR Executive. Her passion is helping businesses turn positive intentions into positive impact. That's such a powerful statement, and I love that. So Lily is also the co-author of Gender Ambiguity in the Workplace, which focuses on the narratives of 25 gender-diverse people's workplace experiences navigating ignorance, harassment, and discrimination. So given that a big component of this year's summit focuses on radical inclusion, Lily and I will be talking about what it means to radically include transgender and non-binary people into the workplace. And we'll also talk about who transgender and non-binary people are. So if that's new to you, don't worry, we'll go through some basic terms, why this aspect of inclusion matters to the future of work. And then, of course, we're going to gain some everyday strategies to re-examine our diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments from a lens that transcends the gender binary. We'll also talk about what the gender binary is. Okay, so Lily, welcome to the summit. I'm super psyched to have you here. Are you ready to create cultures of belonging together?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm so happy to be here today with you.
Yeah. Okay, so I talked a little bit about your book. So you are the co-author of Gender Ambiguity in the Workplace, and it shines a light on the workplace experiences of gender diverse people. So for folks that aren't familiar, let's go through just some basic terms. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by gender ambiguity, and then talk more about who gender diverse people are?
Yes. Cool. So gender ambiguity is the state that we talk about in the book where you look at someone and you can't necessarily tell what gender they are. And this is a relevant topic, I think, to a lot of people, especially in our current political climate, because you're seeing the rise of trans visibility in a way that hasn't ever happened before. You're seeing more people push the boundaries of gender, push the boundaries of what we call gender expression, how people express their gender in terms of their clothing and their mannerisms, the way they talk, the way they speak. And what's happening is that if you imagine that there are these rigid boxes, I know the gender binary question is later, but we might as well hit it.
Let's do it now. Yeah.
Imagine that there are these very rigid boxes. There are two of them, and they say man and woman. And people grow up in these boxes, and most people live in them. These boxes dictate what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. For example, if you're a man, you might get criticized by liking hobbies like sewing. Mm-hmm. If you're a woman, you might be criticized for liking MMA, just because we have all these arbitrary distinctions into these two little boxes. So the idea of gender ambiguity is recognizing that, well, these boxes are A, both arbitrary, and B, not all-encompassing. In fact, there are a huge amount of people that either move between the boxes, exist outside of the boxes completely, are somewhere in the middle, float around the edge. But that sort of experience, and there are many such experiences like we reviewed in the book, those experiences aren't really in our conversation yet. And so we wrote Gender Ambiguity in the Workplace to take a deep dive into just these experiences and how they impact the workplace, how they impact people's everyday experiences at work. And so the folks that we talked to were folks who spanned all sorts of gender identities and gender expressions. They were, and I can define these in a little bit, trans men, trans women, non-binary people, people who identified as gender non-conforming or gender variant, people who are gender fluid, people who identified more as cross-dressers, people who were bi-gender. Anyways, tons and tons of gender terms. And so we use the term gender diverse to capture the entirety of these experiences and say, well, we can't really pin down any one experience that's outside the binary. But what we're going to say is there are many experiences outside the binary. And if you exist outside of these boxes, like I talked about, you face some difficulties. You face some extreme difficulties, we found, because our society is only just beginning to realize that maybe these boxes are not everything that's out there, and our workplaces are lagging behind.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things that you said in the book, or one of the promises of the book, was just to kind of those 25 narratives, you described trans men, trans women, non-binary folks, agender folks, bigender folks. I mean, lots of different ways of talking about being a part of this population of gender diverse people. So can you talk a little bit more about what you learned through writing the book around some of the differences that gender diverse people experience in terms of their overall kind of workplace experiences?
Yes, absolutely. I actually recently just spoke to the Harvard Business Review on this, but what we found in the book was that, surprisingly, gender diverse people's self-identities didn't seem to predict the workplace experiences they had, which definitely surprised us. There were so many people that identified as trans men that had a huge range of experiences, and so many people that identified as trans women that also had a huge range of experiences, and so on and so forth. And what we ended up finding out was that people's experiences in the workplace, whether they were discriminated against, whether they were treated well, whether they were included or excluded, was very dependent on how their coworkers were perceiving them. It was almost entirely dependent on this external perception. And so we found people who say, well, this is my identity, this is what that means to me. But if someone else in the workplace would look at them and say, no, you seem like a blank, they would almost always treat them according to their stereotypes and assumptions about blank, rather than engaging at face value with what these gender diverse people were self-identifying as. And so it was a very messy landscape that we found, because gender diverse people almost didn't have too much control over the discrimination that they faced. It seemed like many of them were at the mercy, if you will, of their colleagues, who were saying, okay, you say you're a woman, but you look like a man to me, so I'm just going to treat you like a man in a dress, which means I'm going to discriminate against you. And no matter what this, trans woman would do, her employees would view her like a man in a dress. And so she would have to take very, very drastic measures to change that sort of external perception, even if that wasn't what made her feel authentic. And that was such a powerful and, somewhat depressing finding, because oftentimes in the space we talk a lot about authenticity. Oftentimes we talk a lot about, just be who you are. But from our findings, we found that authenticity didn't necessarily get you what you wanted, right? If all you want is to work without discrimination, oftentimes people found that they went to their point of authenticity and hoped for getting, they hoped that they would be treated well, and they weren't. So then they had to go, in some ways, inauthentically in some direction. They would have to wear too much makeup. They would have to change their appearance. They would have to cut their hair way shorter than they would like. They would have to even change the pronouns that they used at work, or change the name that they use at work, all to get other people to treat them in a respectful manner. And that was surprising. That, I think, was a very, very surprising finding that applied to pretty much everyone who we talked to.
Yeah. It's just that power of perception. And it reminds me, there's a question, this is dealing with young people, but the CDC has a survey that they pass out to states, and states survey young people between the ages of 9th grade through 12th grade. And there's a question around gender expression where it is asking young people how they think other people perceive them and how they express their gender. And lots of folks don't like the way that the question is asked. But I think what you're communicating underscores the value of that question and how powerful society and society's expectations are of all of us around how we perform our gender. And in the workplace, how that can make or break an experience of, if we feel included in general, but radically included, that's a whole other level. And that leads to my next question, which is just kind of reflecting on your younger self and your workplace experiences. For you, when you think of radical inclusion, what does that mean? Have you ever experienced it in the workplace? You're running your own consulting firm now, so I hope like you as your own boss experience that every
Oh, I
day,
think I
right?
include myself pretty
Yeah,
well.
good. I'm glad you're showing up authentically in your business, right? But I mean, it's very much more complicated when you're working for someone
Right.
else. So, any experiences that come to mind where either it was a great experience where you felt radically included, or you could at least paint a picture of some of the things that might have been lacking to fully experience
Right.
that.
So I'm going to start my answer to that question by trying to define for myself what radical inclusion means,
Yeah.
and then I'll talk about some experiences in which I felt like that. Um, in my own career so far, I would say radical inclusion means that I feel empowered to show up at work with as much of myself as I want to bring on any given day. And I say that because sometimes that varies, right? Maybe I don't always want to bring all of myself to every workplace all the time, every day, every week. Maybe sometimes I want to be more private. Maybe sometimes I want to be withdrawn. But I would say the key characteristic of a workplace that enables that type of radical inclusion is enabling my agency to share or to not share, to be out or to be not out, to be visible or less visible. And that is a very, very rare characteristic, I think. I've been in workplaces that are very good at, well, we were just talking about the binary extreme. So either they are workplaces where everyone is somewhat compelled to over-disclose, to overshare,
Yeah.
or there are workplaces where no one feels compelled to share anything. And I've been in both. I've been in a workplace that was very social justice focused, and that was hard because it seemed like everyone was always self-caricaturing themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They would say, all right, I'm coming to work as an asexual, queer, bisexual, transgender, Chinese American, second generation, middle class, able-bodied, neurodiverse woman.
Right.
And then someone else would say, great, and I'm here as a cisgender, bisexual, Muslim, disabled woman from this. And it's just like, oh my gosh, like,
A lot.
I don't actually know how to engage with you because now we're just seeing each other as like weird clumps of identities.
Yeah.
Which are undoubtedly important, but everyone feels compelled to overshare. Right. And so it's almost as if in our zest for inclusion, we are fetishizing is not the right word, but we are not letting people, challenge what it means to be any of these things, and we're not letting people exist in their own way outside of these identity terms. And so that wasn't great. And I've also been in a workplace where it was predominantly white, it was predominantly heterosexual, it was predominantly cisgender, and so I got the very firm impression that to fit in, I just shouldn't ever be talking about my identities because no one ever talked about theirs. They were all cisgender, heterosexual white men. And if I said, oh, I'm a woman, they would instantly get uncomfortable. Or, oh, I'm Chinese, they would get very uncomfortable.
Right.
And so, no, I didn't feel included in that workplace either. So I would say that, of course, in my consulting business, this is the first time I've been, feeling radical inclusion. And maybe that's why many people start these consulting firms. The research from the book actually revealed a shocking number of trans entrepreneurs, which is both an amazing thing and a very sad thing. The sad thing being that, well, there are more trans entrepreneurs because the workplace doesn't want them. So they can't get 9-to-5s because of this discrimination. So they turn to entrepreneurship and self-employment. And that's a messy case. I love trans entrepreneurs, and I wish that we had more of a choice in the matter.
Yeah. It's almost as if, I often say this where, you can pass as many laws as possible that add workplace protections, right? Culture also has to catch up to those laws. And I think we're experiencing that at least in this country, and just how how much of a patchwork of trans-specific workplace protections exists. We know that the majority of states don't have these, and at the national level, we certainly don't have that yet. That's why the Equality Act is out there. But what you're speaking to, I mean, this is really powerful. I mean, you've been on both extremes of the oversharing piece, the we share nothing piece, the ultimate covering. And it just sounds like there is this balance. And I really liked your definition where you are empowered on any given day to share things about yourself that are relevant. It's kind of that balance of knowing when to share aspects of your identity that will help contextualize a work project or advance it or make important connections and relationships, but that's on your terms. So I think that's a really powerful definition. So thank you for defining that for the audience in your own words. And, that's something that I would encourage people that are tuning in, think about that definition and does it resonate with you, or, do you have your own? And let's have a conversation about that as we continue throughout the summit, this week. So let's kind of zoom in on some of the clients that you've worked with over the years. And so have you seen organizations, I know that this is like an elusive feeling of radical inclusion, but for those folks that you have supported, have any organizations come close to reflecting the values and practices of inclusion in general, but radical inclusion? Like, you don't have to say specifics, but what were some of the elements that, when you saw an organization really performing and getting close to that,
right?
What was happening?
I'm going to answer your question somewhat in a different direction, which is by saying an organization is only as strong as its middle managers.
Yes.
So I would say that there is no such thing as a radically inclusive organization, because there is no such thing as a monolithic organization, unless you're working in a startup with 2 people. But I'm not going to count that.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is, with every single client I have ever worked with, there has never been a client that is completely, every single person, every single manager is just, terrible and awful. In the same way, there's never been a client where everyone's been perfect, where everyone's been radically inclusive. The norm in, I think, every industry that I've worked with, and I suspect every industry out there, is that there will always be pockets of inclusion, and possibly even radical inclusion, that depend very strongly on the middle manager in place. And insofar as companies are able to sustain a more radically inclusive culture, that requires the sort of strong, powerful, overarching culture, these cultural ideas, that promotes radical inclusion. And I have not seen that yet, but cross your fingers. I think a lot of my clients are interested in building that very thing. But this gets us down a rabbit hole of organizational theory and organizational sociology, and how is it you create a culture that's consistent across every single team when you have a company of like 10,000 people. That's another webinar.
Oh, yeah.
But regardless, let's zoom in on the experiences of middle managers that I found to be radically inclusive. What I found in those teams or those divisions is that these are teams characterized by a few concepts. One is a high degree of trust. So employees believe they trust in their manager, and the managers trust in their employees. This translates to a whole bunch of things. This means that when managers make mistakes, and this is a when, not an if, when managers make mistakes, their employees trust that the managers have their best interests in mind and that they will recover from it, and it's going to be okay. The managers trust that when employees raise grievances or create conflict or express discomfort, that these employees also have the best interests of the team in mind, and that thus there's something interesting behind here that needs to be examined. And so trust is the very first thing. The second, I would say, is very highly related to trust. It's a concept coined by Amy Edmondson called psychological safety. And we talked about it a little bit ago on your podcast, but for the listeners, psychological safety is a group level belief that one can take risks, fail, and be safe. so that you can speak up, you can make mistakes, you can do, frankly, dumb stuff, and mess up publicly and not lose your job, not lose your career, not lose your status, not lose your respect. And this is a concept that's been pretty widely studied for the last decade or so. I think Google recently ran a big study and found that one of the most consistent qualities of their highest performing teams wasn't leadership, it wasn't funding, it was psychological safety.
Yeah.
So that is a very, very core idea. And I found a couple clients with teams that do have psychological safety. And it's just a joy to be in those environments because people view D&I not as a scary, minefield where you say the wrong thing and you get blown up, but rather as we're exploring this together. You're going to know things that I don't know. I'm going to know things that you don't know. And I'm going to mess up. I'm going to mess up right now, actually. I just said a term that's not good. I just did a thing that's irresponsible. I'm going to own the impact of that, and I'm going to make things right. And then we're going to move on because this happens all the time. This happens every day. So rather than treating individual missteps as evidence of you're a bad person or I'm a bad person, it's the team level understanding that all of us are working hard, all of us care about each other, and thus all of our mistakes are made in good faith. And I think every company could benefit from that. I don't know any company that wouldn't say yes to having a culture like that. That's why they bring in a consultant, though, because it's hard to make that sort of team culture. And it's even harder to make that culture a division-wide or a company-wide culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that the psychological safety, trust leads to the belonging piece. I've seen, at least on paper, organizations kind of putting those principles down. And I really like what you were saying about the middle management and how critical it is to kind of like break through, because a couple of colleagues of mine, we kind of joke around, we talk about the frozen middle. It's like, what are the strategies to really kind of work with this cohort of folks that by and large are really the gatekeepers, because you can get, folks on your C-suite, the senior leaders coming in, their tenure is pretty short-lived, 18 months, for a CEO. And, so there's a grand vision always, right? And kind of getting an organization on paper to work towards that vision. You get kind of frontline staff coming in who trending to be younger, not always, right? But just kind of having a kind of, I don't know, maybe an impatience of like, why are we not being more inclusive in our practices? And then kind of these, like the edges of a business kind of pushing that middle group. So I think really focusing in on that is certainly an opportunity. And I really like what you were saying though. And I think when you can build trust and rapport, I think that leads to that feeling of psychological safety and this idea that it's not about perfection. When you do make a mistake, it's about kind of progress. Are you trending towards a positive progress? And if not, like, how do we bring you in to develop you? Right. I mean, that's kind of the ideal that you would want in any kind of position in an organization where you're growing, you're stretching, and it's almost like calculated failure. Like, yeah, we're all going to mess up. We're human, but like, how do we respond to that? I think is some of what you're saying. I think that's really beautifully stated. And I think it's a good reminder when we're doing this work.
Yeah, I just have so many thoughts about middle managers because I work with them so much. And like you said, right, like they're the frozen middle. There's so much untapped potential that's behind these middle managers. And it's not being used because I think, my hunch at least from working with so many of them, is because they don't feel like they're trained to play this arguably extremely difficult bridging role between C-suite execs and frontline staff, but between ICs and the CEO. And I think that's a huge lost opportunity. I think, frankly, every D&I strategy should be centering in the hierarchy, or if not centering, targeting middle managers and finding ways to build middle managers' literacy with D&I topics, finding ways to empower middle managers to take the initiative. And these are some of the projects that I've worked on, but it's so difficult because many workplaces over focus, I would say, either on the C-suite where they view their CEOs as like, visionary profit types that can do anything they want and the organization will magically follow, or completely flip it on its head and treat the organization like grassroots and empower all of the frontline staff, all of the ICs. But then the organization ends up flat as a pancake because no one knows how to hold power, no one knows how to use power, and then no one gets anywhere that way either. And so again, like these middle managers, like we need to be training middle managers on how to build trust within their teams. We need to be training middle managers on how to manage, social justice scandals, on how to, manage up and manage down also, because the middle managers have to manage the C-suite. The C-suite has no idea what's going on the front lines, but the middle managers do. So all sorts of things here that I think are just untapped potential in terms of DEI work and middle managers that I try to get into, but it needs to be a frame shift. I think the field really needs to jump into this.
Yes. All right. So for all of the thousands of people tuning in right now, this is your opportunity. Start targeting the we can call them movable middle rather than frozen middle. But yeah, I agree with you on that. I think it's a different approach. And I like what you were saying around training, like that for some folks who are in middle management, not feeling empowered on how to respond to, as you said, social justice scandals. And I would love for you to define that just for the audience, because I know folks are at different levels. So in your own words, when you say that, what's an example, or what do you mean by that?
All sorts of things. Yeah. Let's say your organization just ran a hiring campaign and it really wanted to hire some people of color, but it managed to hire 10 of them. They all went into the same part of the organization. Everyone was really happy. And then an egregious instance of discrimination happened and all 10 of them left within a year.
Yep.
Just a hypothetical. It's not like I've ever heard anything like that ever happen.
No, that never happened, right? Yeah.
So then you have a situation where, well, it's kind of a disaster. The remaining people of color are like, why the hell should I stay? None of them wanted to stay. Maybe they had a point. Maybe I should leave. The C-suite is frustrated because they're like, well, we wanted diversity. It looks like the diversity didn't want us. And everything's kind of in flames. Yeah. So I've talked to a lot of middle managers in these positions, and all of them want policy corrections. They're just like, what can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Like, should we be hiring people from different locations? Should we be changing up who's doing the hiring? And it's always the wrong approach. Mm-hmm. Because, and here's some free consulting for the viewers here, because it's always about people want to focus on policy. They want to focus on concrete things, but they never address the underlying issues of trust and disappointment and cultural abandonment that a lot of these workers feel when these things happen, right? And you talk to any activist that's embedded in an organization like this, when a scandal happens, the primary feelings are anger, frustration, disappointment, and unless these feelings are dealt with, middle managers will never get anywhere, right? You don't quell an IC's anger by saying, great, we're going to have another campaign, but we replaced, white man Joe, who led the campaign, with, white woman Geraldine, who's leading the campaign, right? Like, why would that make me any less angry? That really wouldn't make me any less angry, because I no longer trust the organization to do its job. So I always tell middle managers, just stop, breathe. It's going to be really uncomfortable. In fact, people are probably going to hate you. Figure out why people are so angry and repair that trust before you try to make any policy move.
Absolutely.
Right? Repair that broken relationship and then work together with folks to realize how things went wrong in the first place. Usually it's a matter of we had a good hiring practice, but we didn't have good retention measures in this company, and we're not very inclusive, and we need to create a mentorship program. We need to create more community. We need to empower our employee resource group. Usually that's the answer that comes out, but you need to actually sit down and listen and be uncomfortable for a little bit to find out what that solution is. And then you can work with your employees to say, thank you so much for staying with this company. I know it must have been really hard. I think we really need more support for new hires of color. Let's work together on how we can support them and make sure that there's a support network in place before we hire anyone new in, so that we don't make the same mistake again.
Yes.
That's probably a good approach to it. And this is just a hypothetical situation. You can take similar approaches with like every single other scandal out there. But if you don't address the underlying sentiment, this is what I'm trying to say. If you don't address the underlying sentiment, none of your policy changes are going to work.
Absolutely. And it's going to root cause. And I think like you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about repairing the rupture and centering it around relationships and having those difficult conversations. And it's fascinating. And I think we talked about this on the podcast when I had you on, but just this idea that managers in general aren't having conversations with those that they're managing, period, let alone difficult conversations like these.
Exactly.
So it's really, how do you build that confidence? And I think like it's that tension between middle management wanting a policy, having something enshrined so that if they're complying with that policy, they won't be quote unquote in trouble.
Right.
And there's some element of critical thinking and judgment that's involved, and that's where people get nervous, because
management isn't about policies; it's about relationships, right?
100%.
And managers are using the first as a crutch to avoid doing the second.
Yes,
and I think it's a problem.
Yes.
Right? Like in almost every company that I work with, it's always the same. Managers are just like, well, our policy says non-discrimination.
Right.
That's the best I can do. And that's always wrong.
Yes.
It's literally always wrong.
Right. Yeah. That's the floor. Like, what's the ceiling as you're working towards radical inclusion? Okay. So I want to kind of bring it back to kind of talking about gender diverse folks. So, so I'm sure some folks in our audience have worked with colleagues that have questioned why they should focus on including transgender and non-binary people in the workplace, given that only 1% of the U.S. adult population identifies as trans or non-binary. So with that context, what's kind of like your go-to talking points when you're trying to support people who want to do the right thing, but again, going back to confidence and starting those conversations, building relationships, a little hesitant to kind of raise awareness and open more hearts and minds for including trans folks?
Right. So I have a whole bunch of different arguments that I make depending on, what would work best.
Sure.
I've got the moral argument, I've got the business case, and I've got the personal stake argument. What do you want to hear first? I got tons.
All three. I think that's,
okay.
Yeah.
So there's a moral one, right? Which is you include everyone because that's what a good company does, right? We don't ask what percent of the people who we're including make up,
Right.
our target population. Like redheads are 1% of the population, right?
Oh yeah.
Are you
like that.
are you going to exclude them? Like does it even matter? Like we're just going to be here and include everyone because it's the right thing to do. No questions asked. Why are you even asking? That's the moral case. The business case, including diverse opinions, diverse experiences, is a measurable business advantage for the organization. So this tends to appeal to like salespeople and engineers. And so you can say we have so many studies at this point. In fact, too many studies. People focus too much on this, on just how powerful having actual diversity in the workplace is, and how powerful it is to include that diversity into the culture of your organization. So the idea here is, if you want to keep a competitive advantage, if you want to keep up with a changing US population, that's a big one, you need to be hiring a workforce that reflects that population, right? Full stop. That's like very, very basic hiring 101. You want to make sure that your employees reflect your population, reflect your audience. And so, that's the business case. There's lots more to be said about that. Diversity drives innovation. Innovation is big. Everyone likes innovation. And then finally, you have your personal stake argument, which I like the best, which is, well, look at it this way. Trans people, gender diverse people are not this exotic other, but rather they are just one perhaps very visible example of people who have an experience of gender. And here's the thing about gender, everyone has an experience with it. Everyone has some relation to gender. And so the idea here is trans people and gender diverse people illuminate with their experiences and, with the discrimination that they face, the sorts of the restrictiveness of these gender boxes that I talked about at the very beginning of this talk. And I would say that these boxes restrict everyone.
Yeah.
It's like I said, I haven't met a man alive that's happy with every single prescription and stereotype about masculinity. And wouldn't it be a little easier to be a man if there were more ways to be a man? Wouldn't it be a little easier to be a woman if there were more ways to be a woman, if there were more ways to be things in between? And trans people are this kind of very, very visible example of people doing just that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you bring trans people into your organization, you make friends with a trans person, I almost guarantee that your personal understanding of gender, your own personal relationship to gender is going to be much healthier as a result. You're welcome, right? Yes. We're doing all y'all a big favor, right? Like we go through all the things that we go through. We challenge gender. We try to do our best to live in the world. And in fact, everyone else benefits. Like everyone else benefits when we push the borders, when we push the boundaries, because it makes more ways for other people to be themselves.
Yes.
And so, like bring trans people into your workplace. Like there are so many benefits, like, not the least being that it's just the right thing to do. And also like discrimination is bad, right? Lawsuits are bad. So, you can always get to that argument. That's kind of like the last straw though. Like, so I try not to lead with that, because if that's all someone cares about, I probably don't want to be sending trans people to work for them in the first place.
Yes.
But there are so many arguments to including, gender diverse people in the workplace, period, right? There are so many benefits that brings to the organization, to the employees, to the trans people, to everyone.
I think I really like how you stated these three kind of categories of talking points, and really getting a sense of who you're talking to. So that whole kind of stakeholder analysis, if someone has said something positive, maybe they have a trans kid, who knows, like they're more likely to be a champion. So leading with that moral argument makes a lot of sense.
Right.
If someone's more analytical and say, like you might be the first trans person that they've ever met, they may need to see more of that business case. And then of course, like just that personal narrative. I mean, it's so powerful, right? I think that, this study was done a while ago, a couple years ago, but less than 20% of people in the United States knew or worked with someone who's trans, right? And so how powerful is it when someone who's never thought that they've met someone who's trans or non-binary before, they're able to establish a relationship? And a lot of that misinformation that is out there, it kind of goes out the window, because it's like, oh, I know Lily's cool, or I know Rhodes is cool, and it just changes that. I mean, that's where change happens. So I really appreciate how you've kind of compartmentalize those different talking points, and considering, that's where you have to kind of be quick on your feet. Who am I talking to, and what might be the best approach? And it's always kind of like going into the lab where you never really know until you start the conversation. You're like, oh, maybe change the talking point to the business case now, or vice versa, So I wanted to talk a little bit about, recognizing, you're an incredibly talented diversity, equity, and inclusion leader.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And one of your specialties includes conducting data-driven assessments of workplaces.
Sure.
So when you're doing this kind of more broadly on the system level, what are some of the factors that you consider with respect to organizations being inclusive, wearing the new lens of considering gender diverse people?
Interesting. So you're talking about metrics. You're talking about things to actually measure, things to actually look at, things to collect data on.
Yeah, metrics, or if you're doing like an organizational assessment, like even kind of looking at the physical space of an organization. Right. Yeah.
So belonging is a big one. You brought it up a lot earlier. You can measure belonging now. There's a lot of research, some of which has come out of Stanford, that actually can concretely measure people's experiences of belonging and give you quantitative data.
Yeah.
And this has kind of been the elusive thing for a while. There's a lot of good qualitative data you can collect from companies, but for a whole bunch of reasons, one being that for some reason data scientists don't seem to like qual data. I'm not one of them. I love qual data. I do almost all qual data.
Right.
But getting quant data is extremely powerful. And now that we're beginning to conceptualize things like belonging, things like psychological safety, things like vulnerability into these metrics, I think that's a huge opportunity. And I don't know, okay, I know, but very few companies are conducting studies or surveys with this data, probably because they're scared of what they're going to find. Usually companies begin and end their DEI data work with demographics. And it's ridiculous, right? Like,
Yeah.
if demographics are the only metric you care about, all you have to do is just hire, 100 LGBTQ plus people off the street, run your, survey and be like, we got them. And then they all quit in the next couple of weeks. And you're like, whatever, our single snapshot point in time showed that they're all here.
Yeah.
And we literally don't give a damn if any of them feel included. And we're not even collecting data on whether their presence actually benefits the organization. Like why wouldn't you do that? Like, why aren't you measuring like the productivity of your team, or why aren't you measuring like how happy people are with the workplace? What I've seen a lot of companies do are engagement surveys, which are fine, right? Engagement is an okay metric, but there's so much more that needs to be done. And again, like going back to these ideas of belonging and psychological safety and vulnerability and conflict too. I think measuring conflict is great.
Yeah.
Because I think if conflict coexists with psychological safety, that's kind of how that is creativity. Mm-hmm. Like, conflict under psychological safety is creativity. Yeah. Where you say, I think this is the best way to do this. And I say, you know what, with all due respect, Rhodes, you're wrong. Like, you're super wrong. Like, I don't believe any of it. In fact, this is the best way to do it.
Absolutely.
And I couldn't say that to you unless I felt safe saying that to you. Yeah. Right? But that moment just now, that is conflict. And workplaces act like it's like the worst thing in the world, but it really isn't. Right now, if I leaned over and punched you in the face, that is bad conflict.
Yes.
But, workplaces are not making the distinction, and they're not using their data assessments in the right way. They're using their data assessments to appease external watchdogs and just kind of placate like outside activists with like, well, we have 4% Black people now, and last year we had 3.9% Black people, so we're a good company, right? And it's very disingenuous, and no one is fooled by it. Like, literally no one's fooled by it. So yeah, I could talk about this forever, but
I think this is really interesting because I think it goes back to this whole idea of radical inclusion, right? And if you're trying to have more quantitative measurement of how you're performing, like you're saying, you can have a dashboard, and this is what I often see, with tech companies. Apple does a job of this. People can suspend their judgment, but it's, the dashboard largely looks at demographics of race and gender, right? And kind of showing that trend line that the numbers are increasing from 2012, you can see that every year, but like that is, again, the floor of like, okay, you're counting people, but like what you're saying, number one, you have no idea where those people are in the organization. So that for all we know, they could be all on the front line.
They're almost always on the front line.
Right, exactly. Like, it's kind of that Christmas tree. It becomes whiter and straighter and more cis.
And retention rates. So I see a lot of companies with like growing demographics, but what isn't like revealed in that is they're constantly cycling in and out of the company, and the company's continually hiring more and more. And so it just looks like it's steadily growing, but it's not the same people that are staying with the company because the retention's so bad because it's not a good place to work.
Right.
That's why I always ask about retention. Like, is your diversity number growing because you're just, because you're retaining 100% and you're just hiring slowly? Mm-hmm. Or is it growing because you're hiring as fast as you possibly can, but it's like you have a leaky bottle and everyone goes in and goes out the next day?
Yeah. And
those are very different organizations.
Absolutely. And that's again, a great analogy of this kind of leaky bottle. And, even if you are looking at retention too, it's still this kind of like very, very kind of 101, we're kind of working towards inclusion, and like what you're talking about, like moving beyond the engagement, and kind of looking at like reputable approaches to measuring belongingness or measuring happiness in the workplace. I think that gets at the culture piece, and everything is culture. Your organization, whether or not you want to admit it, it's either an intentional culture you're trying to create or this implicit culture that you just get. But that is kind of the secret sauce of either keeping people and like really thinking intentionally about, okay, if we want to bring in different demographic or diversify our workforce, like think about like the work that needs to be done first around culture to make people want to stay, right? And it's, it just seems, I mean, we talk about this a lot, within kind of the DEI field, so for anyone who is tuning in and this is not what you do professionally day by day, this is a really important nuance. Like if you're really working to make change, you've got to look at your culture and you've got to think about creative ways to measure it, if people are moved by quantitative data. And I love what you said. I'm a fan of qualitative data too, because it takes just one story for a CEO to be like, yes, we're going to invest in this, right? And that's powerful. But people also want to see these numbers too. So it's a balance. Like you've got to have a couple of great stories and definitely have to measure things beyond just demographics. And, demographics are really important. And I want to say something to that or give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about this. Like when you are working with some of your clients and they're impressed by like, hey, we're collecting all this demographic stuff. How often do you see nuanced questions that are really acknowledging that gender is beyond kind of a cisgender male and a cisgender female, right? Like,
never.
Does that even happen?
Never, right?
Right.
I mean, sometimes I see man, woman, and trans, which is just the worst, right?
Yeah.
It's like not even, those aren't even categories.
Yeah. Exactly.
This is kind of an in-joke, but to explain for the viewers, right?
Sure.
There were plenty of trans people that are men and there are plenty of trans people that are women, right? And trans is not a separate gender to man or woman. It's a modifier to gender.
Yes. Yes,
so,
thank you.
if you're going to put trans on your survey, you should probably put cisgender on your survey too, and put that on a different page as, gender identity. And then you can put man, woman, non-binary, gender fluid, whatever.
Yeah.
But that's getting into the weeds of survey design, which again, that's another webinar.
Yeah. But then, I just think about that, if we're talking like demographics are like the ultimate floor. And if you're not even included on the floor, like where are you? Like where do you kind of?
And then the race questions. I get so pissed about the race questions, right? Like people don't disaggregate Asian. Like they're just like, oh, all Asians are the same. And it's just like, well, are you measuring East Asians and South Asians? Because those are completely different from Southeast Asians, from West Asians. Like what Asians are you measuring? And then, even DEI practitioners make the mistake of saying, okay, white people and Asians are overrepresented in this company. And I'm like, Asians?
Yeah.
Like, you mean the entire continent of Asia, including like the Middle East, which some people call like, West Asians? Like,
yeah.
Who is represented here? Like, if your company's all Chinese people, right, that is not all Asians.
Right.
Like,
yep.
I don't know. I just get really up about it.
Right. So, like all of this to say, there's a need for improvement for the floor, right? Like to make the floor at least like marginally inclusive. I wouldn't even say radically inclusive. Is kind of like take a fresh take. Like if you are asking race, ethnicity questions, nationality, like take a fresh look at it. There's a lot of smart
ask
people.
Some of the people who you're trying to survey how to do the survey.
Yeah.
Try that, right?
Yeah.
Like
focus group it. Yes. Yes. Always ask. Yeah. That's the thing. Okay. So I think that this piece of it though is really important. Like when you're thinking about data, kind of wearing a new set of lenses and, thinking about how gender diverse people fit into that. Right.
Right.
Okay. So for organizations looking to get started on building more radically inclusive cultures for gender diverse people, what might be one or two suggestions that you would give them just to get started? So let's say they've never thought about this before. They're inspired by what you're saying. Where should they begin?
Yeah. So the first place that I ask people to start usually is to examine implicit bias, and not just individual prejudice type implicit bias, but implicit bias that is embedded into systems, into the architecture, into the routines and the norms of the company.
Yes.
What do I mean by that? Well, do you only have binary gendered bathrooms, right? Like that's implicit bias because you are implicitly believing that there are only two genders that are using bathrooms.
Right.
And so if you try to hire a non-binary person and they ask, where's the bathroom after the interview, and you don't have a gender inclusive bathroom, what do you think that the odds are that they're going to accept the position? None, right? Like very, very low. So, finding ways in which bias is embedded in all aspects of the institution is a relatively straightforward thing that you can do literally right now. You can look at how your job descriptions are written. You can look at how your interview processes work. You can look at your promotion criteria. You can look at social events, all sorts of things within the organization. And this is a point that I make often, but because trans people's experience is also a gendered experience, right? Is almost always a gendered experience. There are a lot of overlaps between this and like cisgender women's activism in the workplace as well, because cisgender women also care about listings not being sexist, and they also care about, social events not being to bars. And so there's so much overlap between these two different types of issues. You might as well just, take care of two things at once and examine this bias.
Yeah.
Another takeaway that I can offer is to really look at where you're looking for folks, right? Like look at the pipeline. I don't like to start off with the pipeline because people talk too much about the pipeline.
Yeah.
But the point of the matter is, if you're only going into elite universities to source your people, I mean, you're not going to find, real diversity, right? You'll find like surface level diversity, right? But frankly, if you find, a white business school student from Stanford and a black business school student from Stanford, they're still business school students from Stanford, right? So,
yeah.
So really, really, examine where you're sourcing your candidates. It's
Absolutely.
really powerful as well.
Yeah.
And then I would look at retention. Look at how are you going to keep the gender diverse people who you hire? Do you have an ERG? If you don't have an ERG, why don't you have an ERG? How much funding does your ERG receive? Is it anyone's job in your organization to do DEI work? Are they paid for that work? How much are they paid? What's their yearly budget? What are their resources? How big is their team? What's their head count? Can they hire people? So these are all very, very specific logistic questions, but you need to answer them to be, to have any chance at all at hiring and retaining gender diverse candidates, and frankly, diverse candidates, period.
Absolutely.
Right? Like you need these things in place.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that was like very, very wonderful advice on how to get started. And I really like what you were saying about both kind of looking at your own behavior, right? And kind of where implicit unconscious bias shows up. And we have a lot of resources around the implicit association test and where you can get started on that work, right?
Feelings about that test.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's a starting place, right? But then there's also thinking about kind of the institutional bias that exists. And I think you did a really good job of just kind of walking through some real basic examples of what oftentimes, even if you are the CEO, you're tuning in right now, chances are, unless you are also the founder, you've inherited a culture and organization and systems that were built by someone else. So this is your opportunity of accepting you've inherited this, but what are you going to do to disrupt some of the damage that these systems are actively doing now to both the people that work in them, but also, those that you're serving, whether you're customers, clients, et cetera. So
I'm gonna add one more practice.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Be proactive about learning and self-education.
Yes.
Too many times I see people wait until a trans person's gotten into the organization and then they bombard the trans person with like, I'm just trying to learn. I'm trying to be a good ally. What does trans mean? What does cisgender mean? What does LGBTQ plus mean? Like, can you define every letter of the alphabet for me? And these aren't bad questions, right? So people always get defensive. They're like, what, I shouldn't ask? And no, you should be learning these things, but why are you waiting until you have a new employee to do work that you could Google at literally any point in time?
Yes.
Right? Why are you making this employee feel on the spot, kind of cornered, targeted, stereotyped by confronting them, rather than there's no reason why you need to be asking this person.
Yes.
Right? There's no reason why you can't self-educate, why you can't watch webinars like these to learn information. You can do that on your own, and you should definitely do that on your own. Oftentimes I see people say, Lily, I got a trans colleague and I don't know what to do. And I'm like, you should have reached out to me 2 months ago.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm going to help you, but you really should have reached out 2 months ago. Say, I might have a trans colleague in the future. What do I do?
Right.
Right? That's the question you should be asking. Yeah. And so I would encourage everyone watching this to, not be scared of making those mistakes, not be scared of learning. And like, look, if you know you're going to get a trans person in the office and you don't know anything about pronouns, why don't you get some practice in using, I don't know, they, them pronouns? Why don't you practice with your other colleagues who aren't trans? Like, that'd be great. Like, that's the whole point of allies, right? Because you don't hurt each other when you mess up each other's pronouns. And so like, what a perfect place to practice. And so plenty of examples like that. Like, don't use trans people as your learning experiences, right? Like, we are employees too. We have our own stuff to deal with at work beyond being your like unpaid therapist.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Get your own shit done.
Yes. I want
like a coffee sometime, you know, like that's how it should be.
Yeah. And I want to echo, like, for any kind of individual from a marginalized community, historically underrepresented community, just that, you know, we're not monoliths, right? You know, so you and I are both trans, right? And we have our own lived experiences. If someone wants to get to know us as individuals, cool. You know, like, I'm happy to share about my childhood,
right?
You know, like, but if you're expecting us to educate you about like the enormity of trans and non-binary community,
I have an hourly fee for that.
Yeah, exactly, right. And there is this, Google is your friend. So some of those basic questions, you know, if you don't want to read, YouTube is your friend. I mean, there's just like very powerful, very powerful search engines that are out there that certainly, you know, I mean, forums like this are meant to learn. You know, you're meant to self-educate and connect, and that's what we're encouraging here. But to kind of single out one person because of one aspect of their identity and expect that person to educate you on everything about that particular community that they come from.
They might not even know everything.
Right? I know. Yeah.
I've met tons of trans people that like don't know the first thing about educating people about transness.
Absolutely. So it's like, kind of consider your source, but just start with some general knowledge that's out there on the internet is always a good place to start. And building real, authentic relationships with people across culture is powerful. And it's a balance, right? And you have to do your own self-education. And I think that is just super, super important. And Lily, for our last question, I just want to give you the opportunity, you know, is there anything that you think the audience ought to know about radical inclusion with respect to gender ambiguity that we haven't yet covered that we ought to, just to kind of encourage people to continue their journey of self-education, you know, building relationships with trans folks, et cetera, that you might want to leave us with?
I would say that the future is changing very, very fast. And America is going to become way more non-binary than it is now. If you look at polls of Gen Z, very, very large percentages of Gen Zers are queer, are trans, are non-binary. And here's the thing, the future is not going to be binary. And so if anything, if you care about creating an organization or a team or a company that's going to last 10, 20, 30, 50 years, then this is a big demographic shift. I would say it's on the same level as America becoming a majority minority nation by 2050. 2020? 2050? I think it's 2050.
2040 to 2050. Seems to
something
change.
like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
in that decade.
It's on the same level,
Yeah.
right? I think this is huge, and it's a huge demographic change that people are not talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But your customers, your audience, your employees are going to be challenging gender. And so at the very least, you need to know the lingo to keep up with them. Yeah. I think that's very, very important. I think that is a business imperative just as much as that's a moral imperative. Let's see, what else can I add? Oh, I also want to add that everyone has a responsibility to do this sort of work. And what I tell, all my fledgling advocate, activist clients is there's going to be something, so I'm talking to you as an individual, there's going to be something that you can do better than anyone else around you. Whether that's graphic design, whether that's reaching out to community, whether that's research, whether that's typing really fast, whether that's giving massages, I don't know. But there's something that you can do better than anyone else around you to push trans inclusion forward. And it's your job to find out that thing, to do it with excellence, and to seek out other people around you who you can trust to do all the rest. And I think that's the only way we push this work forward. That's the only way that we sustain the hard work of trans inclusion is we all work together. We all find our niche. We all kick ass and do the best we can in the spaces that we find ourselves in. I think
I love
that's
it.
the biggest takeaway I can give.
That's beautiful. And I love that you were sharing a little bit about demographics. So we'll be sure with all of the supplemental materials that we have available for this talk, we'll definitely have a number of reports so that if you want to dig into some of the numbers that Lily is referencing, those will be available. And I think in your home state in California, for young people identifying as non-binary, I think that number is close to 30%.
It's
25.
huge.
It's massive.
I don't even understand it. Frankly, it's something that I'm still learning about. I had to learn a ton about it because I'm not non-binary, right? So that just goes to show that like, just because you're trans doesn't mean you know every kind of trans experience.
Absolutely. And I echo that as well, for sure. So Lily, where is the best place that we can find you and connect with your work?
Yes. You can find me on LinkedIn at, what is it? LinkedIn/in/Lily Zhang 308.
Cool.
You can also go to my website at lilyzhang.co. That's CO. And you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at the handle lilyzhang308.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for spending so much time with us. I know that I learned a lot, so I hope that folks tuning in, I hope your minds are expanding and you recognize the beauty of gender liberation. I guess that could be the theme of what we're talking about today.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
For everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out our options for getting extended access to all of the sessions and other helpful goodies using the link below. Every purchase also helps me pay the speakers for their generosity, wisdom, and labor in helping us grow the belonging movement. Thank you, and thanks again to today's featured belonging champion.